Islamophobia as a direct result of the way that the mainstream media portray the Muslim community. We've seen mainstream media, we've seen mainstream politicians, we've seen the increase in the far-right groups slowly get worse and bigger over the last 20 years. Now, of course, that's going to have a direct impact on how the Muslim community is perceived. 20 years is not a short amount of time, that's a whole generation of people. That's my son, who's 16 years old now, who's only ever, since he's opened his eyes, had the spotlight on him as a community, as a Muslim. Think about what that does to the psychology of a young Muslim today. So if you've got young Muslims now who've been grown up under the spotlight as being the bad guy or the enemy within, so to speak, then that's only going to cause tension between community groups, right? So let me give you an example. The mainstream, why do I say mainstream politicians? Well, you had David Cameron, who came out with a statement like British Muslims should integrate more. Then you have Theresa May, who comes out with her, as when she was the Home Secretary, coming out with statements specifically for British Muslims. And then introducing the Prevent agenda, which has been around since the time of Tony Blair. And since the Tories came around, it changed again further. So you've got legislation which, from the apparent, from the outside, is very specifically targeting Muslim communities around terrorism, radicalization, extremism. And when you have mainstream politicians who have that mindset, and then they influence legislation which is seemingly targeting a particular Muslim or community group, then of course the narrative has been set now from the top all the way down to the bottom. So then you've got mainstream media who are coming out with, almost on a daily basis, negative headlines against Muslims and Islam. And of course the double standards. The double standards on the mainstream media, you will find when a Muslim does something which is incorrect, because Muslims are human beings. You have the Muslim community group is not one homogeneous group of people. They're very comprehensive, very broad, very wide. So you have different types of Muslims in the community. Some who are practicing Islam, some who are not practicing Islam, and a whole spectrum in between there. But when you lump all Muslims together as one group of people, and then you have the mainstream media who always pick on that particular community group, then of course that's going to change. That feeds into the narrative, but it's going to influence people's thought patterns about how that community group is. And this is all part of stereotyping. Stereotyping leads to racism, essentially, right? So it's all part of the wider racist stereotype agenda against Muslims, from the top all the way down to the bottom. And then you've got the double standards. You know, terrorism, like I say, has no religion. It's across the board. You get people from all different backgrounds, religions, cultures, committing acts of terror. We saw that in New Zealand. We saw it in, we've seen it in India. We've seen it in Burma, in Myanmar. They're not Muslims who have been doing this. But yet, when a Muslim does an act of terror, then the religion is always highlighted, his Muslimness is always highlighted, and they make it into a religious aspect. Whereas when other people do it, their colour of skin is never mentioned, nor is their religion ever mentioned, nor is their cultural background ever mentioned. We've been helping with the Discover Islam Week for many years, not only in Newcastle University, but 5 universities in the region we've been helping with. So we find that it's part of some of the many activities that we do in order to educate non-Muslims about Islam, or the true nature of Islam to the wider community. And the reason why we do that is, I strongly believe that education is the way to move forward. So, look, the reality is we don't have the ear of the politicians, right? We're only, because I think people tend to forget, we're only 5% of the UK population. Muslims are only 5%. But the way that we're being reported on, it's like we're 60%, right? And the way that, unfortunately, we don't have the influence of the mainstream media. So we can't do anything top down, but what we can do is something which is bottom up. So we can change, at least try and change, the perception of people from the grassroots level, by talking to them, by educating them, by showing them what Islam really teaches. The vast majority of people aren't going to learn about Islam from the primary sources. They're not going to go back to the Quran and read the Quran. They're not going to do that. Majority of people aren't going to do that. Very few people who have an interest in it, they might do it. But the vast majority aren't going to do that, to find out what Islam really stands for. Most people are going to learn about Islam through the mainstream media. And I don't know about you, but I don't trust the mainstream media, right? Because as far as I'm concerned, their sole purpose is to make money. So whatever story sells, they're going to sell it. From the grassroots level, it's our job to change that perception. So by talking to people, by engaging with them, by giving them literature about Islam, even a copy of the Quran if they're interested in that, so they can read it for themselves. So the Discover Islam Week is a really important activity every year, because it allows a lot of people to come and find out the true nature of Islam, rather than what they just hear and see on a TV screen or on the radio. And it gets them to interact with Muslims directly. I mean, part of the problem over this last 20 years is we've seen a concerted effort to dehumanize Islam and dehumanize Muslims. So people have certain perceptions about Islam and Muslims based upon that constant dehumanization process. And what our job is to rehumanize Islam and rehumanize Muslims. And the only way you can do that is by engaging with Muslims. So I do an exercise, when I speak to non-Muslims, I say, okay, how many Muslims do you know? Most people say they don't know any Muslims, right? And those who do say that they know Muslims, I say, well, your local taxi driver and your takeaway order doesn't count, right? How many of you know Muslims? Hasn't been to a Muslim person's house, spent some time with them, shared food, maybe had some tea? Very few people have done that.
Yeah.
And it's partly our fault as well. We have to be a bit more proactive in the way that we engage with other people as well. The main misconceptions are, the link to terrorism and extremism. So Muslim men are extremists, Muslim men are terrorists. The second one is, Muslim women are oppressed. So that's a usual one that we hear quite regularly. A third one is that, Muslim men are sexual predators and they're involved in, grooming and that sort of stuff. And, all of them are myths. They're not true. Like I explained to you earlier on about the terrorism one, we know that every community in society has terrorists or some form of extremism. The Muslim community is no different. There's a misconception that the hijab or the head covering or the covering that Muslim women wear is directly linked to oppression, and that's another misconception as well. So Muslim women will tell you this, this is the way that they cover or the why they cover is part of their empowerment for being human beings. It empowers them, it gives them the power to control who sees them and who doesn't see them, or what parts of people can see, or what parts of people can't see. So that gives them the full control and authority over them. So I think these are age-old, certainly this one, Muslim women are oppressed, is an age-old misconception that it keeps getting recycled, if you like. But what you normally find is when you speak to Muslim women directly, those who are practicing, who know their religion and know why they're doing what they're doing, they're very articulate, they can explain things themselves, and they can remove that doubt that they're being oppressed by their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, or whoever. Okay, so there are some incidents which, this is where Islamophobia leads. So I give you some examples of, it can lead all the way up to, from verbal abuse to physical abuse. I'll give you some examples, some of our volunteers. And it's, the interesting thing is it's usually young sisters who get attacked, not the brothers. So it's the sisters who are very outwardly Muslim, wear the hijab and things, out in public, and they're the ones who normally get attacked in these types of situations, and usually by men between the age of 18 and sort of 40, white men between the age of 18 and 40. So it's not just a race or a hate crime, but it's also, in my view, it's a misogyny crime as well, right? Men beating up women, that's that's a form of misogyny, of course. So there's one incident where we had one of our sisters, young sisters, she was traveling on the metro from her home to the university. She was a university student at the time. And she was wearing the full covering. And there was a group of men on the metro who decided that, you know, they'd start swearing at her and shouting at her. She was by herself. And so they surrounded her, and then one of the guys eventually basically got her into a headlock and tried to rip off her headscarf covering, while the others just stood and watched and carried on, you know, swearing at her and stuff. The thing is, not one person on the metro tried to stop that. So that's one example. So she was obviously distraught with that. By the time they eventually got off, and she got off the metro and went to university, she was in shock. This is all in Newcastle, by the way. This is all local. And there are many, many examples like that. There's one example of one of the sisters. She was on the bus, and some of the passengers started swearing at her, calling her terrorist, Paki, you know, all the usual derogatory terms. And she was so shocked. She said, by the end of the bus ride, she said, "I'm never getting public transport again. I'm never going to get on a bus again."